Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight for another Dhamma talk from Tan Nisabho on the subject of mindfulness of breathing. So tonight, Tan Nisabho will be guiding us in some meditation to start, followed by a Dhamma talk. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in so that we can bring them up during the Q&A at the end. And good evening so far to Elaine, Kumu, Geeta, Jens, Ron, Melinda, Aya Vimalanyani. Good to see you, Venerable. Karen, Brittany, Mark, Denise, and other friends who are watching but not typing in just yet. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Tan Nisabho for this evening's meditation.
Thank you. So I think we'll start with a 30-minute guided meditation. And just want to once again express my gratitude for the time here at Empty Cloud with Bhante Siddhasa and Aya Soma. Aya Sui Jana just came as well, which is lovely. And very grateful to be part of the community. So, again. So begin by closing your eyes. Draw the lumbar in, the lower spine. And move awareness one vertebrae at a time up the spine, stringing them one on top of the other, like a string of stones or pearls. Until one reaches the tip of the head, the crown of the head. And then one can imagine a thread suspending the spine from the crown of the head. The body erect, but also relaxed. Sitting with dignity. And one can relax the eyes, soften the neck, widen the chest, drop the chin a little bit. Notice tension in the jaw and relax it. And then one can take 3 deep breaths, really drawing the breath as low as it can go into the belly and expanding the belly, and then holding it, and then releasing it very, very slowly through the nose. And do this 3 times. Allow the mind to relax and just rest in the field of sounds, just letting them come in. Finding a pace of breathing that feels comfortable. You can adjust the breath slightly if you want. Bringing it in longer or exhaling longer. Breathing in shorter, exhaling shorter. Until one finds a rhythm that feels appropriate. And yesterday we used a visualization around the breath, which focused around 3 chambers, dividing the body into a chamber around the head, one around the torso, and one around the belly. And then expanding awareness to encompass all 3, and then repeating. Imagining the breath variously as white mist or a ball of light, which expanded and contracted with the breathing. But the point of an engaged and robust approach to anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, is the ability to play around with these visualizations. So we're going to try a different method called Method 2, introduced by Tan Lee. So imagine the breath coming in through the base of the spine or the base of the skull, flowing down the spine, and then out, down through the right leg and out through the foot into the air, if you're a male. If you're female, imagine it moving down the spine, out through the left leg and out through the left foot into the air. And then repeat that visualization with the opposite leg. And the wave of white light, one can imagine the breath as a white, luminous substance flowing down the spine out. Doesn't have to be perfectly timed with the breath, just let the breathing come and go as it will, in awareness in the periphery, but allow that visualization to bring awareness down. And once one has brought the breath energy down the spine and out each leg, then allow it once more. Breathe in through the base of the skull. Allow the breath energy to spread over both shoulders, down the arms and out through the fingers. And if one wants, one can rest one's hands on one's knees. If having them touching in the lap is too much. Then breathe in through the base of the throat and allow the breath energy to, that white light, to move down through the central channel in the chest, down to the intestines, the colon, the belly. And then finally breathe in through the point right above the navel, allowing the breath to come in there. And then repeat this circuit until the mind settles down, at which point one can expand the awareness to once again feel the whole body, the awareness of which has been cultivated through these visualizations, but allowing the mind to center on one point specifically. And the in and out breathing should be in the periphery at all times with all these visualizations. But when the mind has become calm, allow the awareness to center on one point, either maybe the tip of the nose or the chest, and just stay there, but aware of the whole body, just resting in that. What we're doing is we're drawing the awareness down, reacquainting ourselves with the body, nourishing all the parts of the body with that white, bright breath energy. So once again, that's down through the base of the skull, down the spine, out one leg, out one foot. Once again, at the base of the skull, down the spine, out the other foot. Once again, breathing in through the base of the skull, over the shoulder blades, out both hands. Then breathing in at the base of the throat and allowing the breath to run down the central channel of the chest to the intestines and belly. And then breathing in to the point right above the navel, allowing the breath to come in there. And then once the mind calms, expanding awareness to encompass the whole body. And then one can also play around with acquainting oneself with several stations of consciousness, as they're called in Tan Porlee's technique. Use a famous Thai Ajahn. So one can play around by placing awareness at the tip of the nose, the center of the head, though be careful with that point, the palate, the base of the throat, the chest right above the sternum. They'll be delicate. Be careful not to go too close to the heart area. It can be delicate, just be gentle. And then the point right above the navel. So that's the tip of the nose, the center of the brain, the palate, the base of the throat, the sternum, right above the sternum. And then right above the navel. And if one wants, one can allow the mind to rest in each of those places once those active, dynamic visualizations have become too much. And just see how the mind feels in each of those, what sort of resonance the breath has. Those of you familiar with chakras or qigong or yoga will notice a correspondence between these points and some of the points described in those systems. So just do these things, play around until the mind calms down, always keeping the breath there, and then allow it to center and still. On one point, but with the whole field. And as the mind calms down and settles into one spot, such as the tip of the nose, allow it to very carefully track the breath right there, like a smooth silk thread, very subtly, and trying to keep that awareness continuous so that there's no break between the inhale and the exhale. Just that smooth sensation, continuous. And if the mind grows tired of that and moves into a broader awareness again, and the broad awareness should be there in the background at some level. If it moves out again into broad awareness, still keep that breath there as well, always. Until the wider field of awareness and that sensation of breath at that one point merge, and one is with both. Just relaxing into that. Now look for a second at this body. This is a topic that we usually save for monastics, that of contemplating the body as unbeautiful. But it's important to realize that this is not a practice of cultivating negative body image, which is comparing our bodies to other bodies, but rather seeing all bodies as what they really are, just in a clear light. And most of us realize we're deluded about the fact that we will die. We realize that we don't quite acknowledge this fact. But we're completely unaware of how deluded we are by what the Christians call this mantle of clay. And so our delusion is profoundly deep. And yet, looking clearly at the body and dismantling a bit, just taking a slight step back from it, is a great act of kindness. Because seeing through the body, even a little bit, dismantles the self in a nitty-gritty way that the usual koans that Westerners are so attracted to in those high wisdom teachings cannot always do. And you imagine what something as beautiful as the mind and heart, how it compromises itself when it identifies itself completely with what is effectively a mass of calcium, water, flesh, hair, oil, blood, sinews, lungs, tissue, phlegm, mucus. If it really believes it's that at a deep level, then how much does it darken itself? And this is the great irony of contemplating the body, is that when one steps back just a bit, the mind finally has the ability to be as bright as it truly is, or to be brighter. And then we stop judging everyone by their bodies. And that's a great act of kindness, to actually see someone separate from their appearance, to look at their heart instead. And we can say we're doing that, but unless we've actually worked to cool the fires of attachment and lust to this frame, then it's mostly just talk. And if one breaks through attachment to the body, most of the teachers say one will see one stage at least of awakening. It's such a powerful insight. But it doesn't tend to go over in Western circles as well as metta, so we don't talk about it much. But when the mind is calm, one can look at these things and begin to see. One can run through the list of the 32 parts of the body until one of those objects catches one's attention, and then one can stay there with that object, contemplating it, bringing it to mind. So one can look at, especially powerful objects tend to be the skeleton, the bones, feeling how the vertebrae are just so many pebbles, so many stones. They're just calcium. They're no different than the stones you walk on every day. Same with the bones running through the arms, the joints, the skull right beneath, covered by a thin veneer of skin. One can look at the skin itself, contemplating how it constantly exudes oil. It's constantly oozing. If we go without bathing for 1 or 2 or 3 days, this becomes very apparent. It soaks into the clothes. It soaks into the hair. The body begins to smell very quickly. One can contemplate the hair itself. If one has seen a close-up of a hair follicle, one sees how it's dead material. In fact, everything we see of the body is dead. All the live skin, if it was exposed to the air, would be far too painful. It's all hidden. The hair, the skin, the nails, the teeth, which are just bones, only so many more stones. All of it's dead. The eyes only look alive because they're moist. Everything we see at another person is dead flesh. One can imagine the stomach acid inside, all the liquid elements of the body, the blood, the mucus, the saliva. When one's stomach rumbles, one can think of that mess that's internal. And how all of this is hidden from us by a thin veil of skin. And that's it. But that if that was stripped away, everyone would look exactly the same and be quite a bit less attractive to boot. Or one can track the body through its stages of decomposition. These are called the charnel ground contemplations. So imagining a body laid out, how the stench begins, how it swells up, becomes bloated and green. And then dries up, becoming just bones, sinews that scatter and return to the earth. This may not be what you expected when you joined our live stream, but these contemplations, though they rub people the wrong way at the first, can be very helpful. Because sexual lust causes huge damage in people's lives. And having some tool just to dampen it a little bit, because nothing else in society is helping to do that. So that one has some amount of control over it is important. And the more one reads the suttas and the verses of the elder monks and nuns, the more one sees that they constantly speak about looking at the body, contemplating the body, because it was key to many of their insight of all the loci of identity. The body is perhaps the most significant one to break through initially. And even just by contemplating this way, the Kruba Ajahns, the great teachers, say that every defilement is attenuated, softens. And yes, it can seem difficult, but all we're doing is drawing back the veil that's hidden the heart. All we're doing is becoming a little less attached to the veil and allowing our own and others' brighter part, their chitta, shine through. And so though initially it comes across as a strange practice, it's actually a very beautiful one. And you'll know it's working when the mind begins to become more and more luminous as one contemplates. But if one begins to feel the mind darken, then one should turn back to a more bright object like the breath. But if one has come to a calm place and then turns the mind to contemplate the body, then as one does that, the mind will become very interested, usually particularly in one object, and just let it contemplate that object, bringing up images of it, imagining it, playing around with it. And then the mind will become cool and calm and brighter. And then one will be able to look at the homeless man on the street, or the beautiful person of the opposite gender or the same gender who one is attracted to, and see them for who they are rather than just what one is attracted to physically.
Thank you, Venerable, for that guided meditation. And hello to some other friends joining in. So hello to Angela, Adine, and Marielle. And hello as well to all the other people who came in as we got started. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Tan Nisabho for this evening's Dhamma talk.
Thanks, Bhante Sumino. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So that's the first Asubha talk I've ever given in the West. We don't give those a lot for probably what reasons are fairly obvious. But it really is a powerful practice, especially if you've gone on retreat. There just comes a point where the mind doesn't want to use a tranquility object anymore. It's as if the glass is just completely brim full, and it'll get very scattered unless it has some way of using that energy. And channeling it towards contemplation of the body is a powerful way to utilize that energy. And if it's truly calm, it'll be very interested in looking at the body because it knows at some level that it's missing something. And if it's calm, then it'll have the capacity and the energy to actually see for the first time what this body is, just a mantle of clay. And then one just can develop a much healthier relationship with it, because the body will betray us. It grows old. It is a sort of awkward creature. It's the Buddha said, "Who but a fool would consider this body healthy even for one moment?" Because it's constantly falling apart. And if we can stop clinging to it with such a tight-knuckled grip, then we can kind of accept it as the sort of awkward, sweet creature it is. I mean, it's doing its best, but it's not easy, you know. So it's a much better relationship with it. So the talk tonight was titled The Biblical Breath. And I was interested in looking having some fun with looking at how the breath, and to be honest, some other Buddhist concepts are encoded into the Bible and into the biblical tradition, because this is the tradition and the imagery I grew up with, and I think many of us did. And though, assuming you're on this live stream because you've come at least in part to Buddhist practice now, there's still some deep strata of our spirit and psychology which is grounded in those images. We've grown up with them, many of us. And the sort of dream, there's a part of us which functions at a subconscious level of dreams and archetype. And to access that part of ourselves, sometimes it can be very helpful to look at these images and not throw all that imagery out right away. And there is great wisdom in these traditions. The Bible represents the distillation of millennia upon millennia of wisdom. It gathered stories from countless different traditions and distilled them, granted with an agenda frequently. But it doesn't mean that there's not wisdom there as well. And it can be fun to explore that. And one can really gain an intuition of this, the power of this imagery by just, in Buddhist thought, a celestial being, whether you believe in such things or not, is referred to as a deva. And just think of the resonance in the heart between, if one grew up in this Western Christian tradition, between the word deva and angel. And there is really, one is not foreign, it's bright, and it accesses something very deep. So sometimes drawing connections between these two traditions can be very helpful. One of my favorite parallels between the two is the word dukkha. In Pali, you can play with etymologies a lot, but there are some interpretations of the word dukkha as the axle of a wheel that is off center slightly. And this is debatable, but it's a fun etymology, so we'll use it for the sake of this talk. Dut means bad, and ka means to hold, or it can mean that. And so this idea of a dukkha, suffering, stress, however you want to translate it, being the idea that things aren't quite aligned correctly. They're always slightly off in our lives, and sometimes very off. And in Christian tradition, the Greek translation of sin is hamartia, which means to miss the mark. And that's a much gentler translation of that word than sin. And also one that seems to bear resonance with the Buddhist concept of dukkha if it's conceptualized as this wheel off kilter. So this is one of my favorite parallels, and was one of the things that made me interested in looking into other images in Christian tradition and otherwise, which might provide wisdom if seen through a Buddhist lens. So one can begin with Genesis, and the first image of Genesis is the spirit over the waters. And for those who are familiar with the Buddhist extremely complex and advanced model of human psychology called the 12 links of dependent origination, Paticca, which is a series of 12 links describing how we compound our suffering. So ignorance, which specifically means ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, leads to sankhara, formations, which leads to consciousness, Vijnana, which leads to name and form, Namarupa, which leads to Salayatana, the six sense bases, to contact, to feeling, to craving, to becoming, to birth, death, suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And then it begins again. And each of those terms could take up many Dhamma talks. I think Ajahn Sucitto once famously had a course titled Beginning Dependent Origination for Advanced Meditators. And I thought that was pretty funny. But the interesting term here, at the very beginning of the cycle, this term of vijnana, vi means to divide or to spread out, and jnana means knowing. So the concept of a division in knowing, a divided knowing. And this is interpreted various different ways, but I think there's an interesting way of looking at it in terms of the observer and the object of experience, and that distinction being made and solidified. And where I find it resonates with this image is you think of what the prehistoric equivalent of a mere was, and it's water. It's all they had. So to begin everything in Genesis with the image of the spirit, awareness, the breath over the water, effectively seeing itself, suddenly splitting into both the subject and the object in terms of it being able to perceive itself as an object and becoming self-aware in that way. That's a very interesting image. And it's echoed in other traditions as well. In the Norse mythology, one of the first mythological images is that of Odin sacrificing himself to himself. So it involves the implicit, similar splitting of the self into both the subjective observer and the object of observation, the arising of self-awareness. And this also resonates with the moment of the fall, where you have Adam and Eve suddenly becoming aware of their nakedness when they eat the apple. And what I believe that may imply is simply that suddenly, instead of looking just out at the world, suddenly they were aware of themselves as selves, which is why suddenly they perceived themselves as naked, because they were aware suddenly of the self as an object as well. And then shame and death and everything stems from there. And for me, this resonates also with a particularly important sutta called the Tuataka Sutta. It's Samyutta Nikaya 4.14. And in it, someone asks the Buddha, I asked the kinsman of the sun, the great seer, about seclusion and the state of peace. Knowing in what way, seeing in what way, is one completely freed? And then the Buddha answers, one should put a stop to the root of all objectification, classification, the thought, I am the thinker. So this term objectification, classification is a joining of, or one iteration of a really important term which many of you may know called papancha in Buddhist thought, which is translated more commonly as proliferation. And I think the best description of papancha is in another sutta called the Madhupindika Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 118. And in it, the Buddha says, dependent on, he goes through each of the 6 sense bases, but he says, dependent on the eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact as a condition, feeling arises. What one feels, one perceives. What one perceives, one thinks about. What one thinks about, one proliferates, papancha. Based on that proliferation, the categories and perceptions of past and future forms cognizable by the eye assail him or her. So, to put it in simpler terms, papancha is what happens when we take a simple experience, this perception, say, or a way of feeling, and we run with it. So what, one can say fail in a small endeavor, or maybe one slips up and forgets something that they were supposed to bring to work. And instead of it being just that much, something forgivable, small, it instead becomes something much bigger. One thinks, I always do this. This is how it always is. And then an image of one being blamed for a previous moment of forgetfulness comes to mind, and maybe a whole constellation of experiences from childhood replete with enormous emotional tones and memories all come into being based on this one small experience. And this is how things proliferate and spread. And how the interesting thing about the Tuataka Sutta, which just referenced, which says that the root of this papancha is the thought, I am the thinker. And this is interesting because it's one of the few suttas that really points to what the root, the essential ingredient to all that papancha is. And it's this crystallization of the sense of self, the turning the self from just a subject into a very concrete object. And then all these constellations of how we think about ourselves, of berating ourselves, of memories about how one did this wrong or did something right, how it can go either way. All these things begin to circle and orbit around that nucleus of the self, which has been formed and solidified in the mind, the thought, I am the thinker. So it all begins right there when the self becomes an object instead of just a subject, and a concrete, emotionally charged object. So, as is the case in the suttas, so frequently the Buddha speaks about these things in unbelievably detailed terms and very clearly. And yet it is interesting to find encoded in the images in Genesis something similar happening, where awareness itself splits into subject and object, both in the terms of the wind over the water and the implicit image of a mirror, and also in Genesis with Adam and Eve perceiving themselves suddenly as naked and becoming self-aware, and how this moment is tied inextricably from the moment when all of life and its subsequent dukkha comes into being, and death as well. So far this has very little to do with the breath. But we're getting there. One interesting point is the fact that the spirit over the waters In every tradition, there's some image of the breath. It's so essential because it's a part of ourselves which is partly under our control and yet not completely. It has its own rhythm. It's this essential ingredient. And in the concept of conception of these early systems, especially as echoed in the guided meditation we just went through, the breath was not just the wind at the nose, but rather the vital energy that courses through the body. It's what connects us to the external world. It's life itself in a certain sense, pana. And so we see it echoed just in that first moment, the essential nature of it. But also there's a very interesting concept or idea of what the centrality of the tree image in almost every tradition. When one looks at the tree as the spine, and in the yogic systems, the state of most human beings is conceptualized as this spine of energy, this axis of the spine, with the what's called the kundalini, the serpent coiled at the base, where it has become trapped and effectively manifests as sexual lust. And the goal of those yogic systems is to draw that serpent of energy up the spine until one unifies the whole field of awareness and unites these different energy flows into a pillar of unified awareness. So the interpretation of the tree image and of the fall from grace in this concept, or in this imagining, and granted this is a pretty liberal one, but I think it's interesting, is just that the tree is such an essential image because even long ago people had discovered the centrality of the spine as the central axis along which this energy runs, and the experience of samadhi as embodied in that unified field of energy centered on the spine is so singular and powerful and representing a united awareness that it took on essential significance in terms of imagery. I'm not sure I really buy that that's where Genesis came from, but it's certainly an interesting parallel. So the idea here is that the eating of the apple and the snake through temptation of the snake represents the sexual impulse which hijacks that energy at the base of the spine and trapping human beings in a lower state than they were in when they were residing in the garden itself. The snake represents, and the apple, all that energy suddenly coalesced into just sexual lust. And this speaks to experience. If one begins to cultivate this flow of the energy that we've been speaking about, specifically down the central meridian, along the chest, and then up the spine, then the knotting of the sexual energy at the base of the spine becomes very perceptible. And one realizes that one can open those channels and allow that energy just to run up the spine again and circulate, and it dissipates naturally. And much of our sexual impulse is the need to release that energy that's been coiled and caught down in those lower stations of consciousness in the body. And this image of the breath body, of the central axis appears elsewhere. If that first tree is the tree of death, then one wonders in those biblical traditions where the tree of life manifests. And I've heard many point to the image of Christ on the cross as that place. And Buddhadasa, a famous teacher in Ajahn Buddhadasa, a famous teacher in Thailand, who was very intent on speaking to and bridging traditions in a certain sense, said that he really liked the image of a cross because it was an eye with a cross through it, as in sort of the concept of I crossed out or negated. So the sacrificing of that same ego and self, and it's allowing it to fade. And that is where divinity manifests in the Christian tradition. So, yeah, this has been a bit of a foray. We tried. I had to come up with a topic about the breath, and I always wanted to try this out, so we did. But I'm not sure how much else I have to say around it. Apart from the simple fact that there's two approaches to truth that the Buddha spoke of, or that are spoken of in the Christian tradition, apophatic and cataphatic. And apophatic is, I believe these terms may have been coined by Thomas Aquinas. Apophatic is talking about God or truth in terms of what it is not. And cataphatic is talking about truth or God in terms of what it is. And in all of history, I know of no teacher who is as such an apophatic specialist as the Buddha. The aim of the Buddha's teachings is to not point to the nature, not describe in detail the nature of ultimate reality, whatever that is, in terms of if we have a self or if we don't. The Buddha refused to answer that question, because ultimate reality is beyond, or whatever nibbana is, whatever awakening is beyond description, beyond words. So what the Buddha applied instead, and this is a frequent mistranslation or misinterpretation of the Buddha's teaching. He did not say there was no self. What he did was teach a strategy towards looking at all those things that we usually take as a self and realizing that they are not worthy of being called such. And as we let go of those things, namely the five aggregates of the body, feeling, perception, volitional formations, sort of programs, and consciousness, as we let go of each of those things, realizing that they're changing, that they're not under our control, then whatever we come to speaks for itself. And that is nibbana, awakening. And there was no need to articulate it in detail, because once you taste it, the Buddha said that's enough. There's no need to talk about it in too much detail. And I think there was great wisdom in that way of teaching it, because with so many of these higher states of realization or concentration, there's a tendency to become completely attached to them and reify them, turn them into concept. And the Buddha watched his teachers, initially Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, get caught in high states of concentration and take those as ultimate reality. And so he was brutal in his technique of cutting off every possible way we could become attached to these lower states of realization, instead pointing us again and again to let go, wherever there's the slightest sign of stress or clinging, to let go. And by parsing things down to this simple and pure seed of a teaching, it is planted, whatever soil it's been planted in, a flourishing articulation of pointing to or trying to indicate what Nibbana is has grown up. You think of the art of Tibet, the Zen paintings. There was no need for the Buddha to go into those articulations himself, because the cultures seemed to do that on their own. What he tried to do was create a teaching which would last 2,500 years. And he did. And this was especially fine because the Buddha was teaching in an environment where most had grown up with a concept of divinity and the divine deeply ingrained in their spirits. And yet one takes that same teaching and brings it to a dry materialist worldview, such as most Westerners have. And when the Buddha says, none of these things are you, then intuitively the mind of the dry materialist Westerner intuits nothing as its replacement. If you remove all that, what is there left? And so there's a deep sense of nihilism that undergirds subconsciously so much of the teaching. And I think this is why so many of the teachers now in our tradition have tried to point more and more and articulate more and more what it is that does come when everything's let go of. So Longpa Sucitta speaks constantly of the chitta, the mind and heart. Longpa Sumedho, one of the senior teachers in our tradition, speaks about the deathless constantly. And these are beautiful ways of pointing to the fact that when everything's let go of, it's not nothing. In fact, it's the highest of all things. And by helping us remember that when we let go of these things, it's not just a dry void that welcomes us, but rather the Buddha compared the awakened mind to light. And this is one thing the Christian tradition gives the Western mind, is a concept of something to humble the self to. It makes it much easier to let go of the self when one has a concept that one isn't left with nothing. And yet the problem is that when one conceptualizes that, one automatically compromises the concept and tries to articulate what is unarticulatable. But I think we can recognize the power of having some articulation, some way of pointing to what comes when everything's let go of, and bring that into our practice a bit. And just really remember that the Buddha said that when we let go, we do rest in something, we come to something. Whether one wants to call that the deathless or the chitta, it's not nothing. And also that intuitive awareness, as Longpa Sumedho puts it, has certain resonances in our lives. And not that one can point to that exactly, but that when one lets go of these constellations of a self, something does guide one. The stream of Dhamma does guide one, and one can get more and more sensitivity to that still, small voice speaking in every moment, to the chitta's motions and guidance and voice. And this is why we meditate. It's why we make space in our day for that small voice to speak, because that's what is truly trustworthy. And I'm not saying that is the deathless, nothing like that, but that there's something there that will guide us when we let go of all these machinations of the self. And so we don't have to articulate it as much as the Christian tradition does, but it can be useful to take a page from their book and at least name it and pay homage to it. And in essence, that's what Buddha is, not just the historical Gautama, but rather the highest ideal of awakening. Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
So thank you, Venerable Nisabho, for sharing those words of Dhamma with us. And there are lots of thank yous as well from our online audience. And if there are any comments or questions at this time, feel free to type them in. And welcome to Venerable Varapanyo, who's joining us as well. And our friend Mary says, in the Torah, God is named in Hebrew as Yahweh, or breath. He's the giver of life and breath. Interesting.
That is really interesting, actually. Yeah, if other people know more about other traditions, please type in. I'm very curious. I was reaching a bit here.
And Gita says, Venerable Nisabho, if one diligently practiced the body parts, asava meditation, one will be able to detach from sexual desire and also see not self?
Yeah. I mean, to see not self completely, to let go of all conceit of self, one would also have to let go of the other khandhas, the other locuses of identity. So feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness itself would also have to be seen through. But the many of the teachers I speak to or have heard say that the breakthrough of seeing through the body very clearly with a strong degree of samadhi is paramount or corresponds to stream entry, to the first stage of enlightenment. It's such a profound experience. And we don't realize how deluded we are in the body. It's the great secret. And the Buddha speaks to it constantly, as do our teachers, but it's just not taught in the West because it's not very popular. It's much more fun to spread metta and such, but it's very powerful. And it will attenuate not just lust, but all the defilements really are wound and bound in the body. So if one can step back from the body just a little bit, all those fires of greed, hatred, and delusion cool. And it's a profoundly powerful practice. It dismantles the sense of self at a really basic level. So one does have to keep an eye out. If one's an aversive type, then the next day or that day even, but sometimes it's such a powerful practice that sometimes it can take a few days to really see the full effects of it. But one may wake up really grumpy. So if you're a greed type, this is a pretty safe practice and it's healthy. If you're an aversive type, use it with caution. If you're in a relationship, you contemplate how much to use it. Maybe don't always tell your partner, but it's a good thing to have in the tool belt, because you think of the damage done by sexual lust and people breaking relationships and trust based on these things, and it's just it's not appropriate. So to have some way of cooling those fires is very useful. And yes, it is a extremely powerful means towards liberation. The Buddha pointed again and again to contemplation of the body and mindfulness of the body as the path to liberation. And that certainly includes these contemplations. In fact, in the Satipatthana Sutta, the comparative studies have shown that these contemplations of the 32 parts, the 4 elements, the asubha, the charnel ground contemplations are really what the Buddha singled out in that first foundation in many ways. So it's very powerful.
Thank you. And Sunita says, this was a very impactful meditation. Thank you. I hope you don't mind my questions. Why did you say that if we focus our attention in the middle of the skull or by the heart to be careful? And then when we inhale near the throat and then later near the belly button, should our exhale be at the same place?
Good question. So the pineal gland, which is the point in the middle of the brain, and once again, these stations of consciousness, the method I just spoke to is contained in a book called Keeping the Breath in Mind, translated by Ajahn Jeff Thanissaro Bhikkhu, but originally written by Ajahn Lee, a very famous teacher in Thailand. And it can be found on dhammatalks.org. So it's a very powerful technique, and it's a lot of fun to play with. He is very cautious about that point in the head, as are most teachers I know, initially, because most Westerners are stuck in their heads just by default. So there's a huge amount of energy up there, and the diaphragm is very constricted, which forces awareness up. So if one immediately goes to the head, especially if one is prone to headaches and such, it can be way too much. So one has to be gentle there. But my sense is that if those meridians have been opened up, if one has cultivated this full body awareness, say one has taken up Qigong a bit, one is able to actually draw the awareness down into the lower part of the body, then it's safer to go up to the head because the energy has already been spread out a bit and it has the ability to drop when it needs to. That point in the middle of the brain is a really important point, though. It's, in my experience, it has the ability to clarify and brighten awareness immensely. In fact, it's singled out in a lot of places as the where the perception of light and knowledge really can gather. But yes, it's something one should approach delicately, especially if one is just beginning this way of spreading awareness. The heart, I've heard many people warn against using too casually, especially because people tend to actually focus on the physical heart, whereas one wants to aim a little bit in the center and a little bit lower, near the heart chakra, as it would be known in Kundalini yoga. It's a delicate area with a lot of feelings. It's safer if one is at the heart chakra, rather right above the sternum, rather than actually the physical heart. But if one brings one's awareness there, one will feel it can be very tight. There can be a lot there. So these are safe somewhat to explore when awareness has become refined and calm. One can sort of tread these waters, but initially, especially when the awareness is intense and coarse, it can be kind of dangerous to just go stomping into these areas. There can be a lot contained there. As to the breathing in to the mainly I tend to not focus the visualization on the exhale. I just breathe into that area and then let the light kind of be there or dissipate. And there's a very similar visualization. The fun part about working with breath in this way is that there's a huge amount of room to play, and many of the systems of conceptualizing the breath body are very similar across traditions. So the Taoist system echoes these same points. They have a thing called the Microcosmic Orbit, where one inhales through these doorways along the central meridian at the sternum, at what they call the dantian, by the navel, at the perineum, through the kidneys, through the shoulder blades. And there's honestly, in that orbit, maybe there's many points, 12, 13, maybe many more. So you can have a lot of fun with it if you look into it. But yeah, I just say focus on the inhalation and just let that bright white mist of light spread and play around with it. One will also notice that certain parts of one's body are really starved for that energy. One side of the body will be numb, usually more so than the other. So yeah, one can balance out all those things a bit.
And Sunita had also asked, is there a reason why the exhale through the feet is different for women and men?
I don't know either. Tanpur Lee speaks about that in the book I referenced. So I mention it because he's a wiser man than myself. The idea is that the nervous system might be different. I found that's been less relevant for me. What has been relevant is the main circulation of energy I work with, and what becomes apparent when this wide body awareness is cultivated, is the central meridian energy flow. So down the chest and up the spine in a circuit. I was trying to look into how different traditions conceptualize that movement, and Kundalini Yoga does conceptualize it as up the spine and down the front. In Taoist thought, this is called the fire cycle, up the spine, down the front. But if one already has a lot of fire element in them, it can be really agitating. I know my mom has had that problem, to trace the awareness that way, in which case one can actually reverse that cycle and consciously visualize the energy coming up the chest and down the spine in what's called the water cycle. And that can be calming. So for me, that reversal has been more interesting than this other difference in direction. But I don't think that's a gendered difference in visualization. It just seems to be something one can play with. And yeah, hold these things I'm saying gently. I am no expert in either of these systems. I've just used them insofar as they've been helpful in terms of brightening and calming my mind.
And I don't know if there are any questions from the in-person audience. It seems like that was the last question online. So lots of thank yous. And Letty from Gadigal, which is in Sydney, Australia, says, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Much gratitude for such an inspiring Dhamma talk. And shout out to Letty because I know them personally.
Wow. Letty, I lived in Sydney for a while. You have a monastery there.
Yes. Part of the Rain Bodhi crew with Bhante Akaliko in Sydney. And yes, lots of thank yous from others as well. Looks like Scott has a comment. Bhante, there's a Jungian concept called the shadow. I see it as greed, hatred, and delusion, and how they manifest in the mind. I would appreciate to hear your thoughts.
Long chat.
So there is a suggestion that we answer that question tomorrow evening, actually, at 7:30 p.m. New York City time, during Monk Chat. So at that time, you'll be able to bring any general or unrelated questions to these talks, but related to Buddhist practice, to a panel of monastics here at Empty Cloud Monastery. So if you can join us then, save your questions, write them down, save them in the Notes app, and bring them up tomorrow. But it looks like that's it for this evening. So tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., we'll continue with Sutta study. So that will be our final talk this week anyway, on mindfulness of breathing. So if you can join us then, please do. And then again for Monk Chat in the evening. But for tonight, we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And enjoy the rest of your night.